the smell of cinnamon was still in the air when the whole room seemed to turn cold around me. Christmas lights flickered against the walls, but all I could feel was the sting of being brushed aside like I didn't matter at all. In that moment, standing there with my hands still trembling from the morning chill, I realized their smiles had never truly included me. If you've ever trusted the wrong people, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Stories like this happen far more often than you'd believe. I didn't know it yet, but that small, quiet humiliation would be the spark that exposed every secret I had never wanted to see. That was the moment everything started to unravel. I still remember how the room felt that Christmas morning. Warm light, the smell of cinnamon, children laughing, and then, in an instant, everything shifted. I was standing there with the smallest request, asking for a little help with a new medication, when my daughter-in-law brushed me off as if I were nothing more than a burden. The words weren't loud, but they cut clean. And when I looked at my son, hoping he would at least soften the moment, all I saw was a laugh he didn't bother to hide. My name is Helen Brooks, and in that moment, I felt something inside me settle into a painful kind of clarity. It wasn't the first time I'd felt dismissed in that house, but it was the first time it hit me that they truly had no idea how much I had carried for them. I stood there listening to them talk about costs and inconvenience, knowing quietly that I had been the one covering the mortgage they were so proud of. $7,000 every month. A secret I had kept to protect them, to give them stability, to help them build a life I thought they deserved. But as I stood in that beautiful living room, their resentment echoing louder than any Christmas music, something in me stopped. I realized I couldn't keep holding up people who didn't even care to see me. That shift happened quickly, pain turning into a calm decision I didn't announce. Not yet. I simply knew the support ended that day. And to understand why I had been carrying so much for so long, I need to take you back to where this all really started. When I look back on my life before that Christmas morning, I can see how the ground had been shifting beneath me long before I realized it. I'm a retired nurse, and after my husband passed away, the house felt too quiet, no matter how many lights I left on. We had built a simple but steady life together, and by the time he was gone, I had enough saved to live comfortably, at least on paper. But comfort feels different when you're suddenly facing each day alone. You start clinging to anything that feels like connection. That's where Brian and Nicole came in. They were my closest family, and in those early years after his passing, I leaned on the warmth of their visits, their updates, their small gestures that made me feel like I still mattered. When they bought their home, I saw it as a chance to help them build something strong. I stepped in quietly, covering expenses they didn't talk about openly, believing I was giving them the same foundation my husband and I once had. I told myself it wasn't about the money. It was about staying part of their world. Maybe that's why it became so easy to say yes whenever they needed help. Financially, emotionally, or just someone to pick up the pieces when life got messy. I wanted to be useful. I wanted to feel needed. And underneath it all was a quiet fear that if I stopped giving, the little bit of closeness I still had might fade away. So when I approached them about the rising cost of a medication I'd been struggling to afford, I thought it was a small request, one rooted in trust. I had no idea it would become the spark that unraveled everything. I remember the days leading up to that visit so clearly. My doctor had just adjusted one of my medications, and the new dosage pushed the monthly cost higher than I could comfortably manage. I had always handled my own bills, but between rising expenses and trying to keep up with everything I had been supporting for Brian and Nicole, I felt the strain more sharply than I wanted to admit. My body had been tired, too. Some mornings I moved slower than I liked, and that alone reminded me I wasn't as invincible as I once felt in my nursing years. On the drive to their house, I kept rehearsing what I wanted to say. It wasn't a big request, at least in my mind. I told myself it was just a temporary lift, just enough to steady me until my insurance caught up. Still, I felt that small tug of shame every time I imagined the words. I had spent so long being the helper that needing help myself felt like stepping onto unfamiliar ground. When I finally walked through their front door, I tried to choose a moment that felt gentle, a moment where it wouldn't sound like a burden. But even before I finished explaining why I was struggling, I felt something shift in the room. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was more like a quiet cooling of the air, a sudden awareness that my vulnerability made them uncomfortable. Their faces didn't soften. Their posture didn't move toward me. I felt myself getting smaller as the seconds passed, as if asking for help had revealed some flaw they'd been waiting to confirm. And in that uneasy silence, something inside me began to harden, setting the stage for a decision I never imagined I would make. For a moment after their dismissal, I just stood there, letting the silence settle around me. It was a heavy, stinging quiet, the kind that makes you suddenly aware of your own heartbeat. I felt the hurt rising in my chest, but beneath it was something steadier, something I hadn't expected. It was the unmistakable sense that a line had finally been crossed. I realized, with surprising clarity, that I had been carrying all of us for far too long. As that thought took shape, I felt a stillness wash over me. It wasn't anger. It was more like a deep understanding of my own limits. I knew I couldn't keep pouring myself into people who treated my needs like an inconvenience. The decision formed quietly inside me, almost without effort. I would no longer pay their mortgage. $7,000 every month, lifted off my shoulders in a single breath. I didn't say it harshly. I didn't need to. The truth settled into the room on its own. I could feel the shift immediately. The air tightened, and even without their words, I sensed the jolt behind their eyes. There was guilt there, fear, even, but also disbelief that I might finally step out of the role they had grown comfortable placing me in. For the first time in years, I felt a small spark of strength flicker inside me. Even as my heart ached, that quiet declaration became the first unraveling thread, and by the time I walked out their front door, I could already feel the weight of the consequences beginning to move toward me. I didn't know then how quickly the next sign would appear, waiting for me on my own front porch. I left their house with a strange mix of heaviness and clarity, as if the air outside felt different now that I had finally stepped out from under a weight I'd carried for years. But the moment I turned onto my street, that fragile sense of steadiness began to slip. Something was sitting on my porch, an oversized envelope propped against the door, with no return address. I remember feeling a prickle at the back of my neck, the kind that tells you life is about to tilt in a direction you can't undo. When I picked it up, it felt too heavy for just paper. Inside, the first thing I saw were bank statements, pages of them, carrying numbers that didn't make sense. Huge balances, overdue notices, interest charges climbing month after month. At first, I thought there had been some mistake, But then I saw my name printed across accounts I had never opened. My signature, copied, distorted, appeared on forms approving withdrawals I never made. A second mortgage sat there in black and white, secured using my house, with a signature that looked close enough to pass at a glance, but crooked enough to make my stomach twist. I kept turning pages, my hands shaking, until I reached one document that made everything inside me go still. A life insurance policy. My name again, this time as the insured, signed months ago. The beneficiary listed was Nicole. That was the moment fear took the place of sadness. I thought back to one of our recent conversations, the way her tone had shifted when she asked about my health, the odd interest she took in my medications. At the time, I brushed it off as awkward concern. Now it felt like something colder. As I stood there holding those papers, the phone inside my house began to ring, an unfamiliar number, persistent. I didn't know it yet, but it was the first call from the detectives who would tell me this wasn't just a family issue. It was part of something much larger and far more dangerous. I was still standing in the hallway, the documents spread across my dining table like pieces of a nightmare, when the phone began ringing again. Something in me already knew it wasn't a mistake or a coincidence. When I answered, a calm voice asked if they could speak with me in person. There was no urgency, but there was no softness either. Just a steady seriousness that made my stomach tighten. Within 20 minutes, 2 detectives were standing at my door. I remember noticing how they carried themselves, careful and measured, as if they already understood I was about to hear something that would change my life. They asked to see the envelope, and as they flipped through the pages, they exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. That was when they gently explained that my name had come up during an ongoing investigation, one focused on a pattern of financial exploitation involving older adults in neighboring counties. They had been tracking forged documents, unauthorized loans, and insurance policies taken out without consent. My papers, they said, fit the pattern too precisely for coincidence. When they told me Brian's name had appeared before, my knees almost buckled. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I kept trying to make sense of it, to fit the son I raised into the outline of the person they described. Multiple victims, large sums missing, a trail of signatures that looked like they belonged to frightened people who trusted the wrong hands. I felt grief tear through me in a way I didn't know a heart could hold. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was the realization that he had crossed a line long before he ever hurt me. I wanted to deny it, but the truth sat right there on my table. And in that moment, I knew I had to help them. Someone had to protect the next person he might target. Not long after they left, I heard the sharp sound of gravel crunching in my driveway, the unmistakable sign that Brian had come looking for me, carrying a different kind of desperation. I barely had time to gather my thoughts after the detectives left. I was still sitting at the edge of my dining chair, staring at the scattered papers, when I heard the crunch of tires in my driveway. The sound made my whole body tense. When I looked through the window and saw Brian stepping out of his car, something in me sank. He looked frantic, hair uncombed, clothes thrown together, eyes darting like he was searching for a lifeline. The moment he walked in, the air shifted. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He launched straight into a storm of self-pity, talking about how everything was falling apart, how people were out to get him, how I was supposed to stand by him the way he claimed he once stood by me. His words came fast, layered with just enough guilt to make it sound like loyalty rather than manipulation. But underneath that familiar whining tone, there was something darker. Every time I tried to step back, his voice tightened, and he leaned in just a little too close. The message wasn't spoken outright, but I felt it all the same, an unspoken warning about what might happen if I didn't cooperate. That was the moment the fear truly settled in. Not the fear of disappointment or betrayal, but fear of the person standing in front of me. I kept my expression as calm as I could, nodding just enough to get him out of the house without provoking him. And when he finally walked out my door, the first thing I did was lock it behind him. Then I picked up the phone and called the detectives, my hands shaking, because I knew this wasn't just about him anymore. Someone else was tangled in this with him, and I needed to understand who. The morning of the meeting with Nicole, I felt an odd mixture of dread and determination. The detectives had prepared me the night before, showing me how to wear the small recording device beneath my sweater and reminding me to keep my tone steady. I kept telling myself to breathe, to remember why I was doing this, not out of revenge, but because I needed the truth spoken out loud. Still, walking into that public cafe felt surreal, as if I were stepping into a version of my life where everything familiar had been tilted just enough to feel dangerous. Nicole was already there when I arrived, waving at me with that bright, practiced warmth she had always used when she wanted something. Seeing her smile made something inside me twist, but I held on to the quiet resolve the detectives had told me to maintain. I sat down, letting her talk first, listening as she tried to slip into small talk, pretending everything was normal. Beneath her sweetness, I felt the nerves pulsing through her words, the way she searched my face for clues. I guided the conversation carefully, easing it toward the financial mess, mentioning a few details only someone deeply involved would recognize. I watched her expression falter, her breath hitch. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to steer the blame elsewhere. But the more she spoke, the clearer her fear became. Eventually, the truth slipped out in fragments, fearful explanations, half-formed admissions, a desperate attempt to justify choices she knew were indefensible. The moment she realized she had gone too far, her eyes widened with a kind of quiet horror. Before she could recover, 2 plainclothes officers approached our table. The cafe noise seemed to fade as they gently placed their hands on her shoulders and guided her away. Nicole didn't look back at me. She couldn't. I stayed seated for a moment, letting the weight of it all settle. Betrayal has a strange way of hollowing you out. But in that moment, I also felt a painful kind of clarity. One truth had been spoken aloud, but another confrontation was still waiting for me. One I knew would be far more volatile. Brian was not going to let this go. When I stepped into the parking garage, the first thing that struck me was the cold echo of my footsteps. The place felt hollow, lit by long, flickering strips that cast thin shadows across the concrete. I knew I wasn't truly alone. The detectives were hidden nearby, positioned in the corners and upper levels. But physically, it was just me walking toward the center of that dim, open space. My heart was steady, but my hands trembled slightly. I kept reminding myself why I was there, why I had agreed to this. It wasn't about revenge. It was about ending whatever dangerous spiral my son had fallen into. Brian emerged from behind a row of parked cars, and the sight of him nearly knocked the breath out of me. He looked frayed, stretched thin by panic and sleeplessness. His eyes darted around in a wild mix of fear and calculation. And when he saw me, he tried to pull himself together, shifting into that familiar blend of urgency and manipulation. He moved closer, insisting he needed me, insisting I fix everything, insisting that I recant, that I tell the detectives he hadn't meant any harm. His logic twisted in circles, and I could see the desperation clawing behind every word he flung at me. But when he started invoking the kidnapping story he had used to lure me here, something inside me hardened. I told him calmly, in the same steady tone the detectives had coached me to hold on to, that I knew the story wasn't real. The moment those words left my mouth, I watched something in him crack. For a second, he looked like a frightened little boy, and then the fear turned to collapse. His shoulders slumped, and the small weapon he had been gripping slipped from his hand, clattering against the concrete. Officers surged forward immediately, surrounding him with quiet precision. He didn't fight. He didn't speak. He just let them take him. His head bowed, all the frantic energy drained out of him. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the stillness that followed. It wasn't relief exactly, more like a heavy release, the kind that comes when the worst has finally unfolded and there's nothing left to brace against. And as they led him away, I knew the next part would be facing the aftermath of everything we had both lost. The hours after the parking garage felt strangely quiet, as if the world had gone still to make room for everything I had just witnessed. I went home and sat at my kitchen table, the same place where I first opened that envelope, and let the weight of it all settle. I kept expecting a wave of anger or despair to crash over me, but what came instead was a slow, heavy grief. Grief for the son I thought I had. Grief for the years I spent believing I could hold all of us together by myself. In the weeks that followed, the investigation widened. Detectives uncovered accounts I had never heard of, victims who had trusted too easily, and a pattern that stretched back farther than I wanted to imagine. Hearing it laid out so plainly made something inside me ache in a way I can't fully describe. When the sentencing finally came, it felt surreal. Brian and Nicole both received time, long enough that I knew the lives they had been living were effectively over. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I mostly felt tired, but there was relief too, knowing they wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else. My own healing came slowly. Forgiving myself was the hardest part. Accepting that love can blind you, that wanting to feel needed can cloud your judgment. Over time, I let myself reconnect with my grandchildren through supervised visits arranged by the court. Those moments, small as they were, reminded me that family can be rebuilt, even if some pieces are gone for good. I also found purpose in speaking with other older adults who had been targeted by people they trusted. Sharing my story helped me take back some of the power I felt I had lost. It made me feel less alone, and I could see in their eyes that it helped them feel less alone too. As I look back now, I realize the ending of one life chapter made room for another, one grounded in honesty, boundaries, and a quieter kind of strength. And with that perspective settling into place, I knew it was time to finally close this story and speak from the heart about what it taught me. When I look back on everything, it's hard to believe how far I've traveled from that first moment of hurt on Christmas morning. The pain was real, and the losses were heavy, but they pushed me toward a kind of growth I never expected. I learned that loving someone doesn't mean losing yourself, and that stepping away from what harms you can be its own quiet act of courage. There are days when the grief still rises, especially when I think about the son I thought I knew. But even in that sadness, I've found room for renewal. I've built steadier connections, opened my life to people who treat me with real care, and discovered strength I didn't know I had. My grandchildren have become a soft reminder that hope doesn't disappear just because life turns dark for a while. It simply waits for you to find your way back to it. I'm grateful for the clarity this journey forced me to find. Grateful for the calm that comes after choosing honesty, boundaries, and peace. If you've faced anything like this, or if you're carrying something heavy on your own shoulders, I'd like to hear your story. Share it in the comments. I read everyone,